Good afternoon. Welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. My name is John Corlett. I'm the President and Executive Director of the Center for Community Solutions. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Peter Cappelli, the George W. Taylor Professor of Management and the Director of the Center for Human Resources at the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Cappelli is here to deliver the William T. McCullough Lecture as part of the Center for Community Solutions' 73rd Annual Human Services Institute. Tom McCullough had a lifetime of community service here in Greater Cleveland, including several years as the executive of Community Solutions' predecessor, the Welfare Federation of Cleveland. An endowed fund in his honor continues to help support important educational programs like the one we will enjoy today. Currently, college is seen as a crucial step in order to achieve career success and prosperity. And yet, only 40% of full-time students earn a degree within 4 years. And 30 million, perhaps as many as 35 million, do not finish their studies at all. Those that do graduate often do so with crippling debt. The average student in the class of 2015 is graduating with $35,000 in debt, making it the most indebted cohort on record. It begs the question, is attending college worth the cost? Dr. Cappelli, author of Will College Pay Off? A Guide to the Most Important Financial Decision You Will Ever Make, is here today to provide some perspective on the value of a college education in a rapidly changing world. Dr. Cappelli, an expert in employment trends, the workforce, and education, has spent his career conducting research in human resource practices, talent and performance management, and public policy related to employment. He has degrees in industrial relations from Cornell University and in labor economics from Oxford, where he was a Fulbright scholar. Prior to joining the Wharton School of Business, Dr. Cappelli was a guest scholar at the Brookings Institution, a German Marshall Fund Fellow, and a faculty member at MIT, the University of Illinois, and the University of California at Berkeley. Dr. Cappelli is the recipient of a multitude of awards and accolades. Among them include being named one of the top 5 most influential thinkers in management by Human Resources magazine, being elected as a fellow of the National Academy of Human Resources, and receiving the 2009 Pro Award from the International Association of Corporate and Professional Recruiters for his contributions to human resources. Ladies and gentlemen, members and friends of the City Club, please join me in welcoming Dr. Peter Cappelli.
Well, good afternoon and welcome, and thank you all very much for having me. This is an important event, an important location, and I thought maybe before we jumped in, I would just ask a quick question. We see some students in the room too, but let me just ask you at your table if we could just very quickly figure out who has the most kids at your table, okay? Let's just see, what do we got? Okay, let's see, we got any winners in the room? Let's see, who's got the most at the table? We got 5, anybody beat 5? 5 here, any others? 6, okay. 7, okay. As we say in Philadelphia, to those of you with 7 kids, God bless. Good luck with that one. All right, good. Well, I think the issue of college is a big one. And here's, I think, what has happened with respect to college. Here's the big picture, right? We have shifted over time, sort of slowly over time, from thinking about college as something initially that was done for people with money to help develop them into good citizens to something that's necessary to get a job. And in the process of doing that, we have changed the dynamics in important ways. One of the ways that's most important is that we have made people pay more of the costs of college. And the reason we've made people pay more of the costs of college is because of the idea that college really pays off. So you can start to see how the argument becomes a little bit of a cycle, right? College really pays off, and there's a lot of evidence that historically, and for lots of people, it really did pay off. So then we started to shift the deal to say, well, if it's going to pay off so much, particularly in the public sector, why are taxpayers paying for it? You should pay for it yourself because you're going to get the big return from it. And so we've moved things in that direction over time, and now it's, of course, a kind of open question as to whether we have moved things so far in that direction that it's still the case, right? And part of the other big change, I think, has been that now we have so many more people who are college graduates. The number of college graduates in the US has actually kind of tripled out of classes over the last 2 generations or so, right? So once we have more and more college graduates, is it still pay off in the same way? So let me make first a quick statement for our academic friends in the room from higher education. College is a great thing, okay? It's a great thing. And there are lots of wonderful reasons to go to college, and there are lots of wonderful benefits to individuals from going to college. The question we want to talk about today is just one of them, and that is the financial payoff from going to college, right? What does that look like, okay? Here's maybe the question to ask yourself. Why is it that people who graduate from college make more money? We say this over and over and over and over and over, right? And the statistics that you probably hear, things like the average college graduate, the unemployment rate is half what it is for high school graduates. The amount of money they make on average is about 60% more than what a high school graduate alone makes, or somebody who doesn't go to college, right? The assumption in the back of your head, and many politicians say this, they indicate that therefore is the next unstated part of the story. If you took a high school graduate who was not going to go to college and you sent them to college, their employment prospects would be double, right? Unemployment rate half as much, pay 60% more, that all you got to do is take these kids who were not going to go to college, put them into a college, and off you go. But we know that's not really true, right? And there are 3 reasons why people who graduate from college make more money. Now, the first one is the idea that you actually learn some things in college that are useful and employers are willing to pay for the skills you've got. And when you hear this, you're thinking of engineers, accounting majors, that sort of stuff. The second reason, which we don't talk enough very much about, but we know it's true, is that the average kid who's going to college is systematically different before they enter the door of a college than the average kid who's not going to college. Their families have more money, their families have better connections. In terms of the things around them, in terms of the society and the social support, it's much greater, right? And some extent to it might be ability differences to handle the kind of things that we learn, academic content in college. They're different before they even get to the college door. Okay? How important is that? We know it's not trivial, right? And the third thing, the third reason why college graduates make more money is because there is something about demonstrating that you can actually get through a college program that causes employers to say, well, okay, this kid is really on top of things. That's why there's a big payoff from graduating, but there's not a big payoff just from going to college. And the same thing is true in high school, by the way, right? If you look at the GED degree or certification, right, which is a test you take in lieu of actually graduating from high school, that demonstrates that you have mastered at least a reasonable level of the content in high school. Now, many people believe that test is harder than the graduation requirements of many schools, right? But if you have a GED degree, your lifetime earnings are substantially lower than if you have a high school degree. Why is that? The reason is because employers look at the high school degree and they say, we know this kid at the very least has survived high school, gotten along well enough with other people they didn't get thrown out, can sit still long enough to graduate, all those sorts of things, right? So there are 3 reasons why the average college graduate makes more money than the average high school graduate. And in the back of our minds, or the policy folks who are talking about this, assume there's only one. They assume it's only about the courses that you take, right? So we know that's not true. And that's the reason, getting into this, that we might want to be a little suspicious about the idea that you could just take a kid who was only going to go to high school, pop them into college, and off they go, right? The other thing to just recognize is that when we're talking about this 60% premium for college graduates, that's the average for the population as a whole. And the average person we're talking about is age 46, right? So that statistic of 60% more is something which is true for the average 46-year-old. We have no idea whether it's going to be true for the average 23-year-old or not. And over time, if you look at that premium, it's gone up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down. And there were times when it was only about 30% more. It is the highest in US history at the moment. What's your bet? Do you think it's going to stay that high? Well, We don't know. But there's always the phenomenon of regression to the mean, right? And if you were buying a stock at the point where it was absolutely at the top of the market, most investors would say you might be a little cautious about that. So we just don't know what it's going to be for the class that's graduating now. But the idea that it's going to be the same as it is at this moment for 46-year-olds is probably not such a good bet, right? And the idea that the unemployment rate is half for college graduates what it is for high school graduates does not mean that there are a lot more jobs that require college-level skills. Because what happens is most of you with kids who've graduated recently know, I got 2 kids who graduated from college recently, they end up taking the jobs that the high school graduates would have taken, right? And then where do the high school graduates go? They go maybe to lower jobs, but often to unemployment, right? So the fact that the unemployment rate is half for college grads doesn't mean the job market is terrific for college grads. And here's an interesting statistic. It's kind of mind-blowing, actually. What is the unemployment rate for new college graduates in China, do you think, if you had to guess? The official unemployment rate is 50%. The unemployment rate for high school grads in China is 4%. What's going on in China? And by the way, there's some evidence in other countries too, like Italy, where this seems to be sort of the same. What's going on in China is there really aren't jobs for college graduates, or there are not that many jobs for college graduates, but the college graduates won't take the jobs that high school graduates do because they believe it's beneath them. And so far, their parents are willing to carry them. Now, as a parent in this circumstance, let me tell you that that patience runs out, and my guess, at some point, the college graduates are going to start taking those jobs even in China, right? So let's talk about what determines the payoff. And let me tell you about this book I wrote. I got very concerned about all the arguments subtly pushing people to send your kids to college in a context where people are borrowing a lot of money, often borrowing against their retirement, against their houses, to send their kids to college. Often the kids don't make it. And you end up with this huge amount of debt that nobody's paying very much attention to. So what determines whether this is going to pay off? The reason I wrote the book this way is, frankly, to be completely transparent. These are big policy questions, but I'm trying to trick parents into thinking about them by getting you to read the book, right? Because is it going to pay off for you and your kids? Yeah, you'll learn something about that from the book, but it makes you think about what's going on more broadly in the society. So here's the first thing. The first thing about whether college is going to pay off for your kids is, will they graduate, right? Which we don't talk very much about. All these arguments about, the premium from going to college just assume that if you start, you're going to finish. What percentage of kids going to school full-time in the U.S. graduate in 4 years from 4-year colleges? Anybody know? Parents, you're in the room. I would grab a hold of your drink. It's 40%. So 60% don't graduate in 4 years, going to school full-time, right? Only 60% of students going to school full-time graduate in 6 years, right? That's for a 4-year degree. How many never graduate, of course, we don't know, because it's always possible in the U.S. to come back around and ultimately finish even late in life, right? So it's hard to know for sure how many are completely dropouts permanently, but there's some evidence about 35 million people in the U.S. really have dropped out. That is that, as far as we can tell, they're not going to go back, right? And if you don't graduate from college, there's really no payoff, right, from all that investment that you spent in doing it. And so the rate of return on that investment, that's a huge chunk of money, which is just kind of, from a financial point of view anyway, been blown. Now maybe your kids learn a lot from that experience and it's useful in other ways, but if you have to pay it back and you're going to college based on the assumption that you will get a good enough job to pay off all those loans and you never graduate, that's a big problem. Why don't kids graduate on time? Well, some of it is preparation. We're sending a lot of kids to college who maybe aren't ready to go. Maybe they should go later. 26% of kids in the U.S. are taking remedial classes in college. That means they're repeating high school classes, right? There are money issues. College is pretty expensive, and even if you have the money the first day you enter, you got to pay that every year for 4 years, and your parents, your family, or you could lose your support along the way, right? And here's the last reason why. College majors are way too complicated. And why is this the case? This is because professors create the majors, right? And we aren't thinking about the effect that it has on students. Now, what is this a big deal? Why is this a big deal? It's a big deal because if you start a course, particularly in many institutions which are squeezed for money, and you have a complicated major. Complicated majors, what makes them? A series of courses that are required in a particular order. This is really a supply chain problem. It's, the more courses you require, the harder the major is to complete. But if you have to have courses in a particular order, it gets really complicated to complete them on time. Why? Professor is on sabbatical the year you get there, and the faculty has nobody who teaches that course, so you got to wait a year. Or the most common reason, you change your major, which is perfectly reasonable thing for kids to do. If you don't change your major at least once, you're probably not thinking about it. I mean, if you go into college and you think you know what you're going to do for the rest of your career, that'd be pretty unusual, right? So changing majors. And you change a major and then you discover that you can't get the courses in order to complete the major on time, and you end up hanging around another year. Believe me, this is not just a theoretical issue. And those of you who think you're just going to make your kids graduate in 4 years, neither of my kids graduated in 4 years. They both took 5 years. And it wasn't because I didn't tell them, you can't, you got to graduate in 4 years, right? My youngest son couldn't get the courses. He changed his major at the end of his sophomore year, and he couldn't get the courses. He wasn't allowed to take the courses needed because he had to have these prerequisites done first, and they weren't offered, etc. So that's a big issue you might want to think about, is what do the majors look like? You can tell that pretty easily if you look at the course of program that you're about to enter and what the requirements are. What do we know about what helps kids graduate from college? There's a series of programs. A bunch of people have studied this in higher education, not me, but I can tell you what the summary looks like. Here's one of them, freshman seminars. You're going to a college. Do they have a program where the incoming class takes small classes with real faculty, not graduate students, and only with freshmen? And the reason those are important is somebody who's kind of an adult is watching you and has a sense of what's going on, right? So if you're getting into big trouble, somebody who's responsible really kind of knows, and they can tell somebody else who might be able to help you. What else matters? Tutoring programs matter, but especially these programs now which are kind of interventional. One of the reasons kids get into trouble in college is because we are all overconfident, and that's true of students as well. And students often take courses which they're not really prepared for, right? That's maybe the single biggest reasons kids flunk courses, is they got into something they really weren't ready for. And particularly at some of the bigger universities now, that using big data, they've kind of figured out what it looks like when a kid is going to get into trouble like this. And they tell you in advance. They say, look, we see you've registered for this course. We looked at what you've done so far. It's a very good chance you're not going to make it in this class. Are you sure you want to do it? Right? So they head those things off. Right? Learning assistance programs, not just tutoring, but when kids find out in college, as they often do because the demands go up, that they might have learning issues, do you have a program of support for that? That's something you can look at your college you're thinking about going to and see. And the last one is really social support, right? The reason kids get often into trouble, particularly issues of mental health trouble, is that they feel isolated. So you can look to see what does the community look like here. Are they living in huge dormitories, or are they living in small centers where there's adults sort of engaged in there? Do they have small classes, or are there huge lectures? You can just get a feel for that from the schools that you're visiting. And those things help kids graduate and graduate on time. There are huge differences in this, though. And let me tell you what they are. If you are at one of the elite, really elite schools, what do you get from going to this sort of super elite schools like University of Pennsylvania, where I'm at, right? What is the graduation rate on time at the University of Pennsylvania for the entering class of freshmen coming in? It's 98% graduate on time, right? Nationally, it's 40%. If we look at our nearest state competitor, Penn State, right, which is a very elite school, hard to get into, I don't think the students are so different than our students at Penn State, frankly. The graduation rate on time at Penn State is 65%. What accounts for that difference? We don't know for sure, but my bet is at Penn, we're really watching those kids, right? At the bigger state universities, they don't have the resources to do it. So we're paying a lot more attention to them. What do you buy from these more expensive places? That's one of the things you buy, right? What's happened to the costs? Here's the second issue we might want to think about. Costs have gone up like crazy. Costs are 3 times, well, let's see, they've gone up in real terms, I think 3 times since 1980. They've gone up especially at state universities, 50% higher than private schools. You always hear these scary statistics about what it costs to go to Harvard or someplace like that. 60% of those kids are going to get financial aid in private schools in the US as a whole, so you never know what the real price is. You only see the sticker price. But at the state universities, the financial aid packages are not so great, and their tuition has gone up the most. Why? Because the states have decided not to, political decision, not to fund the state universities and colleges at the level they used to in the past. Why? It's partly because of this idea that college is going to be such a great investment for you that you should pay for it, right? That's the consequence of the ideas here. You know, this club is about discussing these ideas, broad ideas going on in society. This is a big one. If you believe that college really pays off, you could make the case that people ought to pay for it themselves, and that's what's driven the story around state universities and why they're so much more expensive than they were before, right? The US, however, has got a particularly skewed view on this. The average family in the US pays 7 times as much for their kids to go to college as the average parent in other industrial countries, right? 7 times as much, right? And that's partly because college is kind of more expensive in the US for reasons we might have time to discuss a little later. It's a different kind of experience. It's not commuting from your parents' house and sitting in big lecture halls taking a test at the end of 3 years. It's much more intensive, it's much more on campus, but also the government doesn't support it the way it does elsewhere, right? And partly because of the financial aid situation, we have high costs are rising a lot. Families' ability to pay has not gone up very much. We now have more financial aid, but much more of it is in the form of loans, right? And let me say just a couple of things about loans, which might surprise you. The cheapest loans in the United States right now are 4.8% for students, right? You can get a car loan for about 2%, right? And most of the student loans in the US are at 7%. And most of the student loans in the US now, interest accrues from the day you take the loan out. So if you graduate in 4 years, right, with those loans, you're paying an effective 11% interest rate at the end of your graduation because the debt has compounded over those 4 years, right? And here's the other thing about student loans you better know, and that is you cannot get out from under them with bankruptcy protection, right? You declare bankruptcy, doesn't matter. You're still stuck with those loans, right? So they're pretty onerous. If you're a parent and your kid came in and said, I'm going to take out a $50,000 car loan, I bet you'd flip out, right? But if they take out a $50,000 student loan, which is much more onerous than the car loan, right? Most people think, oh, okay, they just sign away, right? And before you take those loans out, you better have a serious conversation with somebody who understands the implications of that much debt. The other thing about financial aid, 60% of kids in the US get it. That's why you just don't know what it's going to cost at a school until you apply and you see what they're going to give you for financial aid. Something like almost 20%, I think, of students in the US who are eligible for financial aid don't apply, right? So what's the story there? Apply, right? Just see what they're going to give you. The other thing that's different about your generation, the kids in the room here, that's different from our generation, people who are older, is the rise of merit student aid. Now, in our generation, my generation, a lot of people will tell you about how they got academic scholarships. They're lying. They did not go to school on academic scholarships because there really were not academic scholarships. It was all need-based until about the late 1980s. The state of Georgia really cracked the barrier, you might say, by making almost, I think all of its student aid in the state of Georgia is now merit-based. It's based on your high school grades, right? Before that, it was entirely based on need. And this changes things a lot. This and the ranking of schools, right? So schools that are trying to get better in the rankings do it mainly by trying to attract students who have higher scores already, higher SAT scores, more selective criteria, so that their performance on these rankings go up. How do you get students to attend your school who are better than the current group coming in? You pay them. How do you pay them? You cut the costs, right? And they cut the costs a lot. The professional career counselors tell me that if you're willing as a student to take a step down in the selectivity of the school that you want to go to, you can get at least a $17,000 a year scholarship, right, which is a big reduction in the cost. Is that worth doing? Well, compared to taking a lot of student loans, it might very well be. What do we know about the payoff, by the way, since we're on this topic of the more expensive schools? Alan Krueger, who was President Obama's chief economist until recently, did a nice study a few years ago. He's from Princeton. And they looked at an elite East Coast university, which might be Princeton. They don't say in this. And the kids who were accepted there who didn't go there, they went to some other school which was maybe less elite, right? And then they looked at them afterwards to see how much money they made. And basically, being in the Ivy League, I can't say this loudly, but we're broadcasting it, there was pretty much no difference. Pretty much no difference, right? Except for kids from lower socioeconomic status, and there they got a bump from going to the elite school, right? But for most of the kids going in, no bump. They did no better. And that suggests that there's a whole lot more to this idea that it's the quality of the talent coming into the school rather than what we do to them while they're there that's driving a lot of the results. Okay? Let's talk about the last thing here, and that's the idea about getting the job at the end of college. What do we know about this, right? The thing that worries me the most is the effort to turn college into job training. Right? And that means trying to make your college experience preparation for your job, and that's kind of it, the first job out of school. The first thing to note is picking the jobs that are going to have a big payoff is virtually impossible because the economy changes all the time. Let me tell you a quick story on this. If you think about IT, right, which people now sort of believe is the obvious job, and if you just go into IT, there'll be a ton of jobs for you, right? In 1991, there was a recession that hit IT particularly hard. Okay? On college campuses, the kids are looking around, and engineering in particular, and saying, where are the jobs? Well, they're not in IT, so they switched to other fields of engineering. When did those guys graduate? A much smaller cohort of IT students. When did they graduate? Mid-90s, okay? What's going on in the mid-90s? The Silicon Valley IT boom takes off, right? And this small cohort which graduated is now incredibly in demand, and their wages are going boom through the ceiling. What happens on college campuses? The kids are looking at this. IT programs are growing by 50% per year on college campuses as all those kids are pirouetting and switching into IT. When did that big cohort of IT kids graduate? About 2001, which is right when the IT bust was. And you dumped all these new IT graduates into that bust, and the market goes kaboom and collapses, right? What's going on there? By the way, in Silicon Valley, only 10% of Silicon Valley employees in tech in the 1990s had any IT degree. That place was built by people who learned on their own, which is another reminder about, do you need a degree to do all this stuff, right? The point about this cycle is, because it takes at least 4 years to get a degree, you're always going to be out of phase, right? If you're trying to chase a job market. Here's the latest. The hottest job in the US the last 4 years, anybody know what it was? By far, nothing else is even close. Uber. No, not Uber. No. I think we have a cynic in the front here. The hottest job in the US has been petroleum engineer, which paid almost 50% more than the next highest paid job. What do you think has been happening to petroleum engineering degree programs in the US? Kids are pouring in them. And bless their hearts, the folks at Texas A&M, which have the biggest of these programs, started warning the kids when they came in and basically saying, don't bet on this job market being here. Of course, what's happening, do you think, to that occupation now? Oil prices have collapsed. Exploration has collapsed. That job market is about to collapse, right? So one of the problems of trying to chase the job market is you're unlikely to be in sync with it because it's often quite circular and cyclical, especially in engineering, right? The other thing about many of these jobs is some of them don't last long, like the IT jobs, programming, right? About 50% of IT people, at least a few years ago when I looked, gave up on IT as a field altogether within about 10 or 15 years because the careers didn't take you anywhere, right? So another thing to think about is, do we really want to be preparing just for that first job? And I think the answer is probably not, right? College should be preparation for a marathon, not a sprint. It's a preparation for life. And in the career world, it ought to be preparation for things that would help you in the long term. I'm going to take about 2 more minutes, and then we will open it up for some questions. Okay, what about a college affects the ability for you to get a job there? If you're kicking tires, and you ought to, as a parent or students looking at colleges, forget about what they're telling you about placement rates, because they don't have to tell you the truth about those. There's no standard requirements for reporting. And how schools report this stuff is not the least bit standard. If you want to see something interesting on this, Google this phrase: law school deans in jail, okay? And you will pull up an article written by 2 Emory Law School professors that looked at how law schools were calculating the job placement rates of their graduates. And they conclude this is outright fraud. They're saying things they know are wrong, right? And it's illegal to do that. So let me tell you, if law schools are committing fraud, they're not the only ones, right? And there's a lot of evidence about how misleading these figures are. So I wouldn't take them carefully. Now, the White House about 2 or 3 weeks ago announced and put on their website some data about the payoff, at least for some colleges, from students, for only those students who've got federal loans, because they can sort of tell, right? And that's sort of useful, but it's not completely useful. The only thing you can do is go to the Career Center and kick the tires, right? See who's coming there, which employers, what do the jobs look like, how much are they paying. That's the best way to get a sense of whether there are actually going to be any jobs coming out of that school or not. But here's the kicker for folks who are looking for jobs. Some nice surveys from employers asking what are they actually looking for, okay? For new college graduates, what do they want? Number 1 thing is internships. Number 2 things, other than internships, other employment you've had while you were in college, like maybe summer jobs. Number 3 is your college major. Number 4 is volunteer experience you've had. Number 5 is extracurricular activities. So out of the top 5 things they're looking at in terms of whether to offer you a job, only one of them has anything to do with what was going on in the classroom. Now, why is that? Well, there may be lots of reasons. I think there's been a shift on the part of employers, which is another big development. Employers are much less likely now to hire kids and try to develop them and train them for a career going forward. They want people who can step in and do the job now. So they want people who've already kind of demonstrated that they can do something like this. This is my last point on this, and that is colleges have kind of responded to the concern parents have about, will my kid get a job, can they pay off these loans, with a slew of very practical degrees and majors that sound like jobs, right? And some of these are amazing. There's a bowling management degree someplace, international tourism, bakery science, you know. You name it, there's a degree with like 3,000, 3,500 degrees, different degree titles now, and most of them sound like job titles. And what's the problem with doing these? Well, the problem is if you prepare for a very narrow field and the jobs aren't there when you graduate, what are you going to do with your bakery science degree or your bowling management degree if the bowling alleys aren't hiring the year you get out, right? What are you going to do with that degree? You would have been better off with a philosophy degree. And there's a bunch of things you're not taking because you're taking those classes in administration, you're learning laws and regulations that would have been useful to help you prepare for life. Maybe some courses that help you think or use data or things like that, right? So there's a lost opportunity as well when you're taking these very practical courses, right? And again, we want to be thinking about this as something that prepares you for the long term. Another thing to be careful of, maybe our last point here, is about this idea of internships, right? Which sound great, very important. When colleges are giving your kids internships, just think what that means. The first thing it means is the employers who are engaging with them, and that's a nice thing, don't have to pay your kids because if it's an educational experience, they're exempt from the Fair Labor Standards Act on this, right? That you have to pay people. But you're paying them, right? Because you're paying college tuition for your kids to work for free for somebody else. And if that's the idea, maybe you want to do that in the summer, right? If you're going to pay for your kids to work for somebody for free, do it in the summer, right? And it might very well be possible, this is the good news, that if you graduate with a philosophy degree and you spent your summers doing something practical, even if your parents were paying you to do it, and you took a couple of online courses, and you got some hands-on experience, employers would be just as happy with you as if you had the degree in hospital records administration or international tourism or something like that. So that's the good news, particularly for advocates of liberal arts, that if you get an education that is really helping you to learn things going forward, and you surround it with other practical experience, it doesn't have to come from college, you could probably do pretty well. Let me pause there, and I think it's time for maybe us to take some questions and things. Yep. Yep. Thank you, folks.
You're very crafty and very subversive. Hello, everybody. Today we're enjoying a Friday forum featuring Dr. Peter Cappelli, the George W. Taylor Professor of Management and Director of the Center for Human Resources at the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania. He's also the author of Will College Payoff? A Guide to the Most Important Financial Decision You'll Ever Make. Turns out that's not a yes or no question. Will College Payoff. We encourage you to organize your questions for our speaker now and remind you that your questions should be brief and to the point. If you're joining us via radio broadcast or our webcast and would like to tweet a question, please tweet it at the City Club. We welcome all of you here and those joining us via the radio broadcast and web stream provided by our primary media partner 90.3 WCPN, WVIZ PBS, 104.9 WCLV Idea Stream, or one of the many other radio stations across the region and country that carry City Club programs. Production, distribution, and broadcast of City Club programs are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Be sure to join us next Friday, October 30th, as we welcome Carla Harris, Vice Chair of Global Wealth Management at Morgan Stanley, for a conversation on power, authenticity, and engagement in leadership. For more information about our upcoming and past forums, please visit us online at cityclub.org. We welcome guests at tables hosted by Case Western Reserve University, Cleveland State University, College Now Greater Cleveland, Cuyahoga Community College, and the Center for Community Solutions. We thank you all for your support. We also welcome students from Chardon High School, Laurel High School, New Tech East, Shaw High School, and Solon High School to today's forum. Student participation is made possible by a generous grant from the Loeb Foundation. We thank you very much for your support. Can the students please stand to be recognized? And now it's time to return to Dr. Cappelli for our traditional City Club Q&A. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding our microphones today are our Director of Programming, Stephanie Jansky, and Marketing and Outreach Fellow, Faye Walker. First question, please.
Hello, thank you for being here. Great, insightful presentation. Wanted to find out if you were aware that First Lady Michelle Obama was in Northeast Ohio this week. Talking about the topic. She actually addressed the LeBron James Family Foundation with LeBron at her side. She introduced something called the Better Make Room campaign, which is really aimed at Generation Z, 14 to 19-year-olds. And it really was just encouraging them to do something after high school, whether it's college or a 2-year program or something.
Yep.
I wanted your thoughts about it and whether you think it's a good thing coming from the White House to be pushing this message.
I think it's certainly a good thing that kids who graduate from college are able to get something that's going to help them make the transition to something, right? Now the problem for kids who are leaving high school now is that many of the things that used to be there before, like apprenticeship programs, right, have largely collapsed. Like employer-provided training have largely collapsed. Like vocational education in high school, which is largely gone. And so the problem now is for high school kids who graduate, they have to wait till they graduate and go to community college and pay for it to get what they could have gotten a generation ago in high school. And this is a policy choice we've made as a country, and I understand why it happened. It happened because we thought that vocational ed was tracking kids into jobs which were dead-end jobs, and it was an opportunity decision. I think given where things are now, if you are a high school graduate, it makes perfect sense to go to a community college for sure. But is this the ideal system? I don't think anybody believes this is the ideal system, right? So I think what I would hope we would think about is, are there better ways to do this? The rest of the world is absolutely dumbfounded why we don't have apprenticeship programs in the US, right? It is a great puzzle, but they've collapsed in the 2000s. They've been sliding for a long time, but they fell by half in the US in the 2000s, even though the population of kids is growing quite a bit, right? So we have this much bigger question, I think, looming. Yes, who's got a next question here? Yes, sir.
Yeah, are those statistics in terms of kids graduating on time, do they pertain to international students too? Because they're some of the most hardworking people I've ever encountered.
The statistics come from the Department of Education's National Center on Educational Statistics. Are they only for U.S. citizens? That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I think for international students, in my school, at least for the MBA program, they're 40% international. There's a big selection bias, right? If you are a kid who is coming from another country, it's much more difficult to get here. We're only seeing the very best of those kids. So it might not be surprising that they'd be different than maybe the average US kid. We're not seeing a representative sample of the Chinese or Indian students who make it to the US, right? Yes, sir.
Yes, I appreciate your comments today. And you've been hitting on this somewhat in the end of your comments, but what are your perspectives on job-specific training and relationships that are built in the college experience and how it's impacting how college is going forward for students?
Well, the big issue is which is a different story altogether, in a different book, by the way, is about work experience, right? So what employers have started to say they want in particularly the last 10 years, is work experience. And why is it that we could have high rates of unemployment, which we had for a long time, and employers still say they can't find people they want to hire? The reason for that is what they want to hire has changed. They're looking for somebody who is working already and has 5 years experience, right? And everybody wants somebody with 5 years experience. Nobody wants to give them the initial experience. So that's the dilemma. And the problem for colleges is that colleges really can't give them what the employers want, which is work experience, right? You could give them some classroom experience that might look a little like work experience, but it's not really what the employers want. So trying to get the colleges to help the employers, or employers to help the colleges, span that gap is really the trick. But by themselves, the colleges can't do it. And I think, unfortunately, if you think about this as a supply chain, here are the employers over here are the parents and their kids here. Colleges are kind of in the middle. These two groups can't talk to each other. They're kind of talking through the colleges. But the colleges, I think, frankly, are maybe not equipped to solve that problem. Because we really need the engagement of employers who frankly have not been that engaged in this. That's been the big problem for a long time. Before this, in 1991, I started, a colleague and I at Penn ran the National Center on the Educational Quality of the Workforce. I was in the Department of Education in the Bush administration, Bush 1, and then through the Clinton administration 2. And in those days, the employers used to say, what do they not like about new student grads, high school and college? It's actually the same thing they say now, which is, they don't act like grown-ups, which is not surprising because they're not grown-ups, right? And it's been that way for a long time. But what is different now is employers saying, we want people who've got work experience. And how we crack that? Without the employer's engagement, I don't know. The one place you've seen some innovation in that, in the private sector, are these boot camps. You know what these are, particularly in the tech world, where the boot camps are basically selling work experience. You go to them, and they'll tell you, we're going to put you onto an IT project. You don't know a thing about IT, but you're going to be working side by side with other people, and you're going to learn it as you do it. Could you learn it better in a classroom? You might be able to learn it better in a classroom. What are you actually getting out of these things? You get to work on real projects for real employers, and at the end, you get a reference letter saying, you built the website for this company. That's what they're really selling. But it seems to be working. Employers like it, so go figure. Yeah, another question?
Yes. Here in the Midwest, we take the college credit plus program very seriously. So students have, since in high school, 7th grade and up, you can attend college for free. Mm-hmm. What is your message to both the parents and the students to take better advantage of programs such as that?
Yeah, well, it sounds like a great idea. I imagine it's not the easiest thing for a kid to do, though, to get into a position where in high school you can also go ahead, finish all the high school requirements, and then hop up into college. But I think if you're a parent and you can push your kids to do that, it's a heck of a money saver, especially if your kid wants to do something which is reasonably hands-on and can go to a community college and get some certificate, Interesting statistic a few years ago, I don't know if it's still true, that about 25% of the kids in community colleges already have 4-year degrees. And I say kids because there's a lot of them that are not kids, right? Already have 4-year degrees, right? Because they're going back to get skills, including my oldest son, right? I got an oldest son who has a classics degree. By the way, if anybody here needs somebody who can translate ancient Greek, see me after class here. We're happy to talk about that. Yeah. Other questions? Yep. Somebody else got one? Yes, ma'am.
How do you advise parents who went to college and were able to pay for it themselves
Yeah,
and turn
right.
around and say,
Right.
I'm not going to support this kid, and don't seem to understand that the government
great
money
point.
is less and the loans are higher,
Yeah.
and the kid can't do it without parent support?
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think it's part of a bigger point, and that is our experience as parents does not really prepare us. Our experience as former college students does not prepare us to help our kids with the college experience today on many dimensions, and one of them is the cost dimension. So I did a quick calculation. I think in the 1950s, at my school, at the Wharton School, you could have worked a minimum wage job and paid off college in about 50 weeks, right? And now it's, I don't know, it was 1,000 weeks or something like that to pay it off. I've forgotten what it was. It was impossible, right? The idea that you can work your way through school, forget it. You cannot work your way through school. It's way too expensive. But there are a bunch of other things we're not prepared for either. One of them is shopping for financial aid, right? That you can negotiate for financial aid if the school wants your kids. And dealing with for-profit colleges is something else which is brand new. You know, almost 11% of U.S. students are going to for-profit colleges now. And their story is completely different, right? They're great at marketing, and they haven't been, as a group, so terrific on the delivery side, right? So you got to deal with marketing, and you got to deal with negotiating. And somebody said, is this like buying a car? It is like buying an incredibly expensive car, right? It really is, right? So I think you got to tell your parents, forget it, right? You can't work your way through school. It's different now. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Good afternoon, Mr. Cappelli. I'm Anthony Price. I'm a senior at Shaw High School. And during the early start of my college admission process, I was encouraged to apply to state schools and safety schools more than Ivy League schools. So, and you talked about earlier about how the results are better for graduates in Ivy League schools. So my question is, you talked about, is college worth it in general? Is college worth, is Ivy League colleges worth the payout for the jobs that college graduates want?
Yeah, so maybe two questions embedded in there. There's a little website from UCLA where you can put in your data and they will estimate for you the probability that you're going to finish on time, based on family income and stuff like that. So is it cheaper to go to a more expensive Ivy League school, let's say, or elite school, than a state university, even if you had to pay for a lot more for it? It might be, because the Ivy League school gets you out in 4 years and the other schools on average takes 5 or 6 years, right? Then it ends up being cheaper, right? So it's possible that it ends up being cheaper, right? If you're making less than $100,000 a year as a family, in the more elite schools now, tuition is effectively free because the financial aid is that generous, right? But if you bump your way down to schools that don't have that much money, it's not so good. The job question, I think the big difference, frankly, in going to more elite schools is getting into graduate schools. The graduate schools really pay a lot of attention to where you went to school. Whether we should or not is a good question, but we really do. Employers don't. Employers don't care so much, right? So with the exception of a very few elite employers who, for reasons that don't make sense, frankly, are focusing on a few elite schools, most of them don't care that much. And you may have seen these stories from England that were in the paper recently. Ernst & Young and, especially I know best, Capgemini, have announced, well, Ernst & Young says their grade requirements hiring in Europe, they're getting rid of them, right? That you had to have a B+ average sort of thing. Not anymore, because they said it wasn't helping them do anything. And Capgemini is actually hiring high school graduates now and turning them into IT people, and a day a week in college and giving them a college degree in 6 or 7 years of hanging around, right? They pay for it, which is really quite different. By the way, college professors in the room, please cover your ears when I say this, but you know how much variation in subsequent earnings we can explain based on college grades? 2%. 2%. My colleagues at the Wharton School refused to believe that when I told them that. Honest to God, they refused to believe it. But it turns out within a job, it doesn't explain very much. It explains whether you're going to get to graduate school. It explains whether you're going to become a doctor or a lawyer, but it doesn't explain in your job whether you're going to make more money or not. So we got one back here. Yep.
Does it make any sense to, I don't think it could make this mandatory, but encourage high school students either spend 2 years in the military or 2 years in government service before they apply to college to
Yeah.
be more mature,
Yeah.
more likely to make right decisions?
Yeah, yeah.
I don't think we could make it, some countries it's mandatory.
Right. Yeah, I think for parents, when it's as a practical decision, I think encouraging your kid to delay going to college is a great idea, actually, right? For all the reasons you suggest. And the colleges, I think, are perfectly happy to take a kid who's done something different. They probably like it better if you come in a little older. And you're right, you're a little more mature, you're likely to do better. Those initial freshman year social bumping that goes around, less of that if you wait. And that's a much better way of getting a payoff because your kids are more likely to get out on time, right? And there are now lots of interesting things your kids could do. I confess, we probably should have done it with one of my kids. The problem was, at the time, all your neighbors' kids are going to college, and the social pressure is really what drives a lot of this. The social pressure also, parents, is what drives us to worry about how elite the school is our kids are going to, because, how can we face our neighbors if our kids don't go to the snootiest school, right? That's a lot of what's going on, right? I just came back from Singapore. The Singapore government has got this big plan to try to change people's thinking about this, to do exactly what we're suggesting here, that there are alternatives besides going to college, that you should think when you do go to college about what actually suits your kid rather than the eliteness of the college in which you're getting into. It's sort of an interesting program, right? Other questions? Got time for a couple more, I guess?
Good afternoon. My name's Julian Huff. I'm a sophomore at New Tech East High School, and my question is, did you ever struggle academically in high school or college?
Yeah, no, I was not a particularly good high school student. I graduated 50th in my class out of 300, I think. I have attention deficit disorder, right? Undiagnosed when I was a kid. And I was just lost a lot of the time in high school, to be honest. And there's a rather surprising number of, well, actually, no, there's not, now that I think about it. I was thinking a lot of my colleagues have similar problems. Not true, frankly. Now that I think about it, really not true. But yeah, I did. And I think the good news is, for me, I got very serious when I was in college, and it was quite difficult, honestly. In college, at least the first 4 years, to get myself to focus, and I had to do a lot of unpleasant things, like basically lock myself in the libraries to get away so that I could focus. And unfortunately, it wasn't until late in life I discovered coffee, which is a great thing. And it turns out now it's good for us. So there you go. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Yes. You've made a very good presentation about how public perceptions of the value of college have changed. That it's now considered more of a private good, a private investment, and therefore you should pay more of the cost of that. So your presentation is a critique of that because you're saying it doesn't pay off. I have actually two questions. One is do you see any possibility of public perceptions about paying for college changing in the future? And two, is part of the argument for change that there's also a public benefit to having more college graduates?
Yeah, that's a great question. Just to be clear on my story, it's not that it doesn't pay off, it's that for a lot of people it doesn't pay off, right? There's this company that's done probably the best rate of return calculations, which are kind of guesses, frankly. They look at what people in the past have made going from this college or that college, and with the appropriate assumptions, they calculate that the rate of return in about a quarter of the colleges they looked at in the US was actually negative going to colleges. That means you would be better off if you're in those schools dropping out, right? And that's astonishing, right? So the idea that it necessarily pays off, which has driven a lot of our thinking, is not true, for sure. Is there a public benefit from this? Absolutely, there are public benefits. And I think in particular, this is one of the things that I worry about, is that there are benefits to employers that we are taking for granted, right? And that the employers, if they really care about getting more students who are better educated, it is important to get behind efforts to support education. Interestingly, when you ask the actual employers what they're looking for, in students, they say almost the same thing that educators say. They want people who can communicate, who can reason, who can get along with other people. When you ask the industry associations, the lobbying groups, they're the ones that are pushing for kids to be engineers and the practical degrees that employers want to hire right out of college, right? So, you know, the state of Texas, the state of Florida, for example, the state legislature has advocated that they defund those majors where the employers don't want to hire kids, and they shift the kids into those fields where they do want to hire kids, which is a recipe for disaster, right? You take somebody who is really good at history and you try to make them a bad engineer, right? And what if they don't, you know, what if there's no job for engineers the day they, you know, when they graduate? Who's responsible then? Do you want to talk to your constituents whose kid did what you told them to, they got an engineering degree and there's no jobs for them, or they're laid off after 2 years and there's no future? Let's go back to our state legislator and ask them why this was, right? It seems to be a crazy idea, right? But that's, you see that movement going on in many, many states, right? Well, I guess we have time for a couple more. Yeah.
Good afternoon. My name's Natoya Walker Minor. I'm over here. To your
Sorry, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Natoya Walker Minor, City of Cleveland. First a comment and then a question. The comment is, this is really a painful conversation to ask the question, will college pay off? It's painful, I think, to even think about it, but it's also painful to know the reality of those that are having trouble becoming employed and the debt that they have. My question is here locally in Cleveland, workforce development, skills gap, unemployment, absence of talent is on the mouths of everyone in Cleveland. And when I hear this question about does college pay off, would it be your recommendation that we push folk toward 2-year certificate programs and hope that they matriculate? I think that that would build upon the question that was over to my right in terms of military, the 2-year preparation. And what is your perspective on certification programs, especially if they don't have direct college credit, and if that too is a waste of time and an accumulation of debt?
Yeah, so I wrote a book before this one called Why Good People Can't Get Jobs, right? Which was trying to deal with the fact that we had all these complaints about skill gaps, you know, that there's, and employers saying they couldn't find anybody to hire. Again, I think this is one of those things where what the employers themselves actually say is very different from what their mouthpieces say, right? And I think if you look at what has happened, the employers are saying we can't find what we want, which is not the same thing as can't find what you need, right? And what they want is somebody with 5 years experience who doesn't need to be trained, and you know they're not willing to pay a lot for it. And they've got these crazy applicant tracking systems now which have replaced recruiters, and so it's hard for them to actually know what they're seeing in terms of applicants, right? So I think it's important, I mean, here's the solution. It's been the same solution since I started working in this area 30 years ago. The schools and the employers have got to get together and figure out what it is that the employers want, what it is that the schools can usefully do, and what it is that one or the other of them have to kind of do to make this transition work. And maybe there's something some third party could do in between. But I think the risk of saying, you know, the problem is that students don't have enough fill in the blank is that there's actually no evidence for that, right? In the US population at the moment, the average American worker has about 1/3 more education than their current job requires. We're turning out lots more college graduates now than ever before. The percentage in college and graduating has gone up. The wages that college graduates are earning, new college graduates, have dropped quite steadily over time. So if you think there's some demand for college graduates, it ain't there. The problem is the wages for high school graduates have dropped even sharper, right? So I think the problem that we're all wrestling with is what do we do to get these kids better jobs? And the problem is giving them more education when everybody else is doing the same thing. You know, maybe that makes sense for your kid. And now what you're seeing, of course, is a bachelor's degree is not enough, right? You got to go on and get a master's degree. To differentiate yourself from everybody else, would that help you? Probably would. Will it pay off for you? We don't know. But if everybody does that, can't possibly work, right? And that's the problem in terms of policy, is that we're pursuing an approach which might work for one kid, but if everybody does it, and that is what's happening, it can't possibly work, and it's not solving the problem. The extent to which we know what the problem is It's employers saying they want work experience, not education. How do we get that work experience? More education ain't going to do it. I think that's the punchline. Right? Thank you.
Today at the City Club, we've been enjoying a Friday forum with Dr. Peter Cappelli, the George W. Taylor Professor of Management and Director of the Center of Human Resources at the Wharton School of Business. Thank you, Dr. Cappelli. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.